The morning sun glinted off the polished surface of Cloud Gate as Keanu Reeves adjusted the ratty wool blanket around his shoulders. 3 weeks of carefully cultivated stubble scratched against his collar, and the meticulously distressed clothing hung loose on his frame. To the casual observer, he was just another forgotten soul in Chicago's crown jewel, Millennium Park. But this was far from a typical morning in downtown Chicago. Hidden in the folds of his weathered jacket, 3 tiny cameras captured every angle of the sprawling park. Millions of viewers watched silently through their screens, witnessing an experiment that would strip bare society's prejudices. "Testing audio check," Keanu whispered, his voice barely a breath. The earpiece crackled with confirmation from the production team, monitoring from a nearby van. Everything was operational. The park began to fill as the morning commute hit its stride. Tourists paused to photograph the bean, while business people clutching coffee cups hurried past on their way to the loop, their eyes sliding away from his presence like water off glass. A young mother pulled her child closer as they passed the bench near Crown Fountain, whispering something that made the little boy stare with unmasked curiosity. Keanu remained still, embodying the invisible nature of his temporary identity. Each averted gaze and wide berth given to his bench was carefully documented. The live feed's comment section exploded with observations, but he focused solely on maintaining his character, letting the world reveal its true nature around him. A Chicago police officer appeared near the Lurie Garden, completing his routine patrol. Keanu felt his pulse quicken slightly. This was a crucial moment in the experiment. Would the officer approach, issue a move-along order, or simply pretend not to notice, like so many others? The weight of millions of watching eyes pressed down on the scene, but in Millennium Park, it was just another morning. Another homeless man on another bench, invisible to most, a problem to others, and a human being to surprisingly few. The social experiment had begun, and its ripples would soon spread far beyond this single park in a single city. Keanu settled deeper into his role, knowing that sometimes the most powerful statements are made in silence. Officer Michael Daniels shifted his weight impatiently, nudging his partner's elbow. "Wallace, you seeing this?" He gestured toward the disheveled figure on the bench near Cloud Gate, his young face hardening with suspicion. "Guy's been there at least an hour. No way that's legal." Officer James Wallace squinted against the morning sun, crow's feet deepening around his eyes. 23 years on the force had taught him to read situations before acting, and something about this one made him pause. The homeless man wasn't panhandling, wasn't disturbing anyone. He was simply existing. "Maybe we should just keep an eye on things," Wallace suggested, his weathered hand resting instinctively on his belt. "He's not causing any trouble." Daniels scoffed, already stepping forward. "That's the problem with your generation, Wallace. Too soft." His boots clicked against the pavement with determined purpose. "These people need to learn there are rules." Wallace watched his partner advance, feeling the familiar knot of conflict in his stomach. 5 years from retirement, he'd learned that not every situation required intervention. But Daniels was still green, still seeing the world in sharp blacks and whites, missing all the grays in between. Tourists flowed around them like a stream around rocks, many now slowing to watch the scene unfold. Phones emerged from pockets, their cameras catching the morning light. Wallace noticed, but said nothing, maintaining his position as Daniels closed in on the bench. The homeless man hadn't moved, hadn't even acknowledged the approaching officer. His stillness was almost unnatural, Wallace thought. Most of the regular homeless in the park had learned to scatter at the first sight of a uniform. But this one was different. Daniel's hand dropped to his belt, automatic, rehearsed. "Time to move along, buddy," he called out, voice carrying across the morning air with practiced authority. "This isn't a camping ground." Wallace shifted uncomfortably, watching the scene unfold. In his gut, he knew they were making a mistake. But sometimes the hardest lessons were learned through action, not advice. He just hoped whatever happened next wouldn't end up on his incident report. "I need to see some identification." Officer Daniels loomed over the bench, his shadow falling across Keanu's hunched form. The morning bustle of Millennium Park continued around them, but a bubble of tension had formed in this small corner near the bean. Keanu lifted his head slowly, meeting the officer's gaze with quiet dignity. "May I ask why?" "I'm simply sitting here, officer." "This isn't a shelter," Daniels snapped, his hand still resting on his belt. "The park has rules against loitering. ID, now." 3 benches away, Sarah Chen paused mid-sip of her morning latte. She'd been enjoying the spring morning, reviewing contracts for her law firm, when the confrontation caught her attention. Something about the homeless man's composed demeanor made her set down her coffee and watch more closely. "I understand your concern, officer." Keanu's voice remained steady, measured. "But I'm aware of the park's regulations. There's no ordinance against sitting on a public bench during park hours." Daniels's jaw tightened. Behind him, Officer Wallace shifted uncomfortably, his experienced eyes scanning the growing number of onlookers. Several phones were now raised, recording the interaction. "Listen here." Daniels leaned closer, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "I don't need a lecture on regulations from someone who can't even afford proper clothes. Either show me some ID or start walking." Sarah found herself reaching for her phone, her coffee forgotten. As a civil rights attorney, warning bells were ringing in her head. The homeless man's remarkable composure and articulate responses didn't fit the usual pattern, but the officer's escalating aggression was all too familiar. "Officer," Keanu spoke clearly, ensuring his voice carried to the gathered observers. "I mean no disrespect, but I have the right to be here. If I've violated a specific law, please inform me. Otherwise, I'm simply exercising my right to exist in a public space." The morning sun caught the lens of one of Keanu's hidden cameras as he shifted slightly, its glint unnoticed by everyone except Sarah, whose eyes narrowed in sudden understanding. This was no ordinary confrontation, and she had a front-row seat to whatever was about to unfold. Officer Wallace watched his partner reach for his radio, a cold weight settling in his stomach. 23 years of experience screamed at him to intervene, but professional courtesy held his tongue. He'd seen too many young officers learn things the hard way. "Dispatch, this is Officer Daniels, requesting additional units at Millennium Park, north of Cloud Gate. Got an uncooperative vagrant refusing to comply with orders." The words crackled across the radio, each one making Wallace wince internally. Inside the nearby production van, screens flickered with activity as comments poured in by the thousands. "This is straight-up harassment. He's literally just sitting there. Someone get this officer's badge number. What law is he even breaking?" The viewer count had skyrocketed to 2.3 million and climbing. Social media platforms were lighting up as clips of the confrontation began circulating, each one more damning than the last. Sarah Chen had abandoned any pretense of working, her legal pad now filled with hurried notes. She wasn't the only one documenting the scene. At least 24 phones were raised around the growing circle of onlookers, their owners torn between outrage and fascination. "Last warning," Daniels barked, his face flushing with frustration. "You need to leave. Now." Keanu remained seated, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to the officer's growing agitation. "Officer, I understand you're doing your job, but I haven't broken any laws. I'd be happy to discuss this with your supervisor." Wallace stepped forward finally, clearing his throat. "Mike, maybe we should—" "Don't." Daniels cut him off sharply. "This isn't a debate, Wallace." He's been warned. Into his radio again. "Dispatch, what's the ETA on backup?" The production team's audio feed caught a whispered comment from a nearby mother to her child. "This isn't right." The sentiment echoed across the live stream's chat, where viewers were now organizing, sharing precinct contact information, and calling for accountability. Through it all, Keanu sat quietly, his apparent serenity masking the careful documentation of every word, every action, every breach of protocol. The morning sun climbed higher over Chicago, promising that this day at Millennium Park was far from over. A man in a charcoal Armani suit broke away from the crowd, his Italian leather shoes clicking purposefully against the pavement. Without a word, he settled onto the bench beside Keanu, opened his briefcase, and began reviewing documents as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Officer Daniels' face reddened. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to—" "James Morrison, senior partner at Morrison & Klein." The man interrupted without looking up from his papers. "I have a meeting in 30 minutes, and I'd like to review these contracts in peace. Is there a law against sitting on a public bench?" Sarah Chen rose from her seat, coffee forgotten. "Actually, I'd like to know that too." Her heels struck a steady rhythm as she approached, legal pad in hand. "Because as far as I'm aware, Chicago Municipal Code doesn't prohibit sitting in a public park during operating hours." Wallace's discomfort was now visible, his weathered face creased with concern. He'd seen situations spiral out of control before, but this felt different. The growing crowd, the phones recording everything, the unusual solidarity forming between suited professionals and a supposed homeless man. None of it followed the usual script. "This isn't about sitting," Daniels snapped, his authority visibly crumbling. "This is about loitering, and—" "Loitering requires proof of unlawful purpose," Sarah cut in, her voice carrying the weight of legal expertise. "Your own department guidelines state that clearly. What unlawful purpose has this man demonstrated?" The live stream comments exploded with support for the impromptu legal defense team. Viewers watched, transfixed, as the power dynamic shifted in real time. "If you continue this harassment," Morrison added calmly, still not looking up from his papers, "I'll be happy to add my testimony to what I'm sure will be an interesting civil rights case." Daniels' hand clenched into a fist. "That's it. You're under arrest." He turned to Keanu, reaching for his handcuffs. "Stand up and put your hands behind." "Mike." Wallace finally found his voice, stepping forward to grip his partner's shoulder. "Think about what you're doing. Everyone here is recording. Everyone." The morning air crackled with tension as Daniels stood frozen, handcuffs half drawn, caught between pride and prudence. Keanu remained silent, his stillness a stark contrast to the officer's agitation, while Morrison and Sarah flanked him like impromptu guardians. The social experiment had taken an unexpected turn, revealing not just prejudice, but also the power of spontaneous human solidarity. "Before you put those handcuffs on, Officer Daniels," Keanu's voice shifted, the careful tremor of his homeless persona falling away like a shed skin. "There's something you should see." The change in his tone made everyone freeze. With deliberate slowness, he reached into his tattered jacket, drawing out not an ID, but a sleek phone. The screen glowed bright in the morning sun as he held it up, displaying a live feed of their own confrontation from multiple angles. A counter in the corner ticked upward, 3.7 million viewers, and climbing. "I don't normally break character during an experiment," Keanu said, reaching up to peel away the prosthetic that had subtly altered his features. The matted hair, the weather-beaten appearance, it all began to dissolve under his sure movements. "But I think we've gathered enough data for today." Sarah Chen's legal pad clattered to the ground. Morrison's eyebrows shot up, his composed facade cracking for the first time. The crowd erupted in gasps of recognition, phones shooting up like a forest of electronic trees. Officer Daniels staggered back a step, his face draining of color as he watched himself on the screen, his earlier actions playing out in crisp high definition. The handcuffs hung forgotten from his fingers. 3 hours ago," Keanu continued, his voice carrying across the now silent crowd, "I sat down on this bench to conduct a social experiment about perception, prejudice, and power. Every moment has been broadcast live. Every threat, every assumption, every violation of departmental policy." Wallace closed his eyes briefly, years of experience telling him exactly how far up the chain this would go. His partner stood frozen, watching his career implode in real time on a screen held by one of Hollywood's most recognizable stars. "The good news," Keanu stood, his movement causing Daniels to flinch, "is that we've also captured something else. We've seen members of the public stand up for a stranger. We've witnessed professionals like Mr. Morrison and Ms. Chen risk their own comfort to defend someone they thought needed help. That's the real story here." The live stream chat exploded with reactions, hashtags forming spontaneously, clips already being cut and shared across every social platform. The experiment had become a movement in the span of a morning. In the sudden chaos of recognition and revelation, Officer Daniels finally found his voice. It came out as barely a whisper. "Oh, God." Officer Wallace backed away from the scene, his hand unconsciously reaching up to cover his badge number, a gesture caught by dozens of cameras and immediately noted in the still-scrolling live stream comments. 23 years on the force, and he'd never seen anything quite like this. "You have to understand," Daniel's voice cracked as he holstered his handcuffs with trembling hands. "The behavior was suspicious. Sitting here for hours, no clear purpose." "Existing without a clear purpose is not a crime, Officer Daniels," Sarah Chen cut in, her legal pad now replaced by her phone, recording everything. "And you've just demonstrated that beautifully." A WGN news van screeched to a halt at the park's edge, its crew spilling out with practiced efficiency. The reporter, Monica Rivera, was already speed-walking toward them, her cameraman jogging to keep up. "I was just following procedure," Daniels continued, his words tumbling out faster now. "Standard protocol for suspicious—" "Would I have seemed suspicious in this same spot wearing a suit?" Keanu asked quietly, the hidden cameras still rolling. "Or is suspicion something we assign based on appearances?" The crowd had swelled, forming a circle around the scene. Phones created a glowing ring in the morning light, each one capturing Daniel's increasingly desperate attempts at justification. Morrison hadn't moved from the bench, but his briefcase was now closed, his full attention on the unfolding drama. "Officer," Monica Rivera called out, microphone extended, "can you explain why you threatened to arrest a man for sitting on a public bench?" Wallace had retreated to the edge of the crowd, already dreading the call he'd have to make to the precinct. Behind him, he could hear Daniels stumbling through a response about maintaining order and public safety protocols. "The fascinating thing about live streams," Keanu addressed the growing media presence, is that they create an unedited record. Every word, every action, every assumption is preserved. It's rather like body cameras, when they're allowed to run. A murmur rippled through the crowd at this pointed observation. More news vans were arriving now, drawn by the viral momentum of the story. The morning sun had climbed higher over Millennium Park, illuminating a scene that had transformed from a simple social experiment into a national talking point. Daniels stood alone in the center of it all, his authority stripped away, not by force or resistance, but by the simple act of being seen, truly seen, by millions of witnesses. The crowd parted like a wave as Captain Michelle Carter strode through, her internal affairs badge catching the morning light. Her face was a mask of controlled fury as she surveyed the scene, tablet in hand, displaying the viral footage that had pulled her from a department meeting. "Officer Daniels," her voice cut through the murmur of the crowd, "your badge and weapon. Now." The command hit him like a physical blow. For a moment he stood frozen, as if hoping this was all some terrible dream. The news cameras zoomed in tight on his face as the reality of his situation finally settled in. "Captain, I can explain." Daniels started, his voice barely a whisper. "The time for explanations was before you decided to harass a citizen for existing in a public space." Carter cut him off. "Your body camera footage, along with this live stream, will provide all the explanation needed for the review board." With trembling hands, Daniels unclipped his badge and unbuckled his weapon belt. Each item seemed to weigh 1,000 pounds as he handed them over. The live stream counter ticked past 4.5 million viewers. "Wallace." Carter turned her attention to the veteran officer, who straightened instinctively under her gaze. "Your inaction today speaks volumes. 23 years on the force, and you couldn't find the courage to stop this." Wallace's weathered face crumpled. "Captain, You'll report for review tomorrow morning. Every moment you stood by and watched this unfold will be examined." She glanced at her tablet. "The department's moving to rebuild trust with our communities. Officers who can't support that mission have no place here." Keanu stood quietly, still recording everything. Sarah Chen had moved closer to the news crews, providing context about relevant civil rights laws. Morrison remained on the bench, a silent witness to accountability in action. "Mr. Reeves," Captain Carter addressed him directly, "I want to thank you for exposing this, but I also want to apologize that it took a celebrity's social experiment to bring these issues to light." The morning had started with a simple question about society's treatment of the homeless. It was ending with a clear message about power, responsibility, and the consequences of choosing silence in the face of injustice. Daniels stared at his empty belt, his career imploding in real time, while Wallace faced the weight of his own complicity. Above them, the Cloudgate sculpture reflected it all. The crowds, the cameras, the aftermath of choices that couldn't be unmade. As the crowd continued filming, Keanu reached into his weathered jacket one last time. Instead of another revelation, he pulled out a simple black marker. The chattering masses fell silent as he knelt beside the bench. His post for the past few hours, his stage for unveiling uncomfortable truths. The marker squeaked against the wooden slats as he wrote, his message forming in clear, deliberate strokes. Everyone who sits here carries the same human dignity. No uniform, title, or circumstance changes that truth. Sarah Chen had lowered her phone, watching the simple act with glistening eyes. Morrison stood from his spot on the bench, straightening his tie as he read the words. Even Captain Carter paused in her stern cataloging of the morning's violations to observe this final moment. A teenage girl near the front of the crowd, her phone already raised, captured the perfect angle. Keanu's message in the foreground, the gleaming surface of Cloudgate reflecting the gathered crowd behind it, the morning sun casting long shadows across the scene. Her thumb hesitated for just a moment before hitting post, sending the image into the digital world. Within minutes, the photo exploded across social media. The hashtags multiplied. #, human dignity. #, Millennium Park bench. #, the Keanu effect. Each share carried the morning's lessons further, transforming a single bench in Chicago into a symbol of our shared humanity and the dignity that binds us all. Keanu stood, pocketing the marker. The prosthetics and costume that had transformed him into society's invisible man were gone, but the truth they had revealed would remain. He looked one last time at his temporary sanctuary, now marked with permanent words, reminding everyone that humanity exists beyond the surface we present to the world. The live stream that had documented every moment of the experiment was winding down, but its impact was just beginning. Across the country, people were already saving clips, sharing stories, and questioning their own assumptions about who deserves to be treated with dignity in public spaces. As Keanu walked away, disappearing into the Chicago morning, the bench stood as a testament to the day's events. Tourists and locals alike would pause to read its message in the days to come, many sitting down to add their own stories to the growing digital archive of the moment when a simple social experiment became a movement. The message remained, a reminder etched in permanent ink. Every person who would sit here shared the same fundamental human dignity, not a privilege to be earned, but an inherent right that no authority could strip away. By sunset, the Millennium Park bench had become a pilgrimage site. People lined up to sit where both prejudice and solidarity had been exposed in equal measure. Some left flowers, others took photos, but everyone read Keanu's message about human dignity etched into the wood. The footage dominated every major network. CNN ran an hour-long special, "The Homeless Experiment, America's Hidden Biases Exposed." Fox News debated the ethics of the social experiment itself, while MSNBC focused on systemic patterns of police harassment against the unhoused. "What troubles me most," Sarah Chen spoke into a forest of microphones outside her law office, "isn't just Officer Daniel's actions. It's how routine they were, how expected. This happens every day to people who don't have millions watching." Social media couldn't get enough. Clips of Morrison's quiet act of solidarity went viral, alongside compilations of Daniel's escalating threats. The live stream recording became required viewing in police academies across the country, a stark lesson in unconscious bias and abuse of power. Critics called it a publicity stunt. "Celebrity cosplays poverty," one columnist wrote, but their voices were drowned out by the thousands sharing their own stories of discrimination, of being deemed suspicious for simply existing in public spaces. Captain Carter's swift response reverberated through police departments nationwide. Internal affairs divisions faced mounting pressure to examine patterns of behavior previously dismissed as standard procedure. Police unions pushed back, but public opinion had shifted decisively. In Chicago, the city council fast-tracked new legislation on police interaction with homeless individuals. The Dignity in Public Spaces Act explicitly protected the right to exist in public areas without harassment. Other cities began drafting similar measures. 1 week after the experiment, a small ceremony took place at Millennium Park. The bench was officially preserved, Keanu's message sealed under clear coating. A small plaque was added. "On this site, A single act of solidarity sparked a national conversation about human dignity. But perhaps the most profound change happened in the quiet moments. A businessman offering his seat to a homeless woman in Central Park. A Seattle police officer sitting down to talk with a man on a bench instead of demanding he move. Small ripples of humanity spreading outward from a single morning in Chicago. The experiment had ended, but its question lingered. How many more invisible people sat on how many more benches, waiting for society to acknowledge their fundamental right to exist with dignity?